Welcome to this edition of FREESPEAK, a podcast of the Namibia Media Trust, and I'm Gwen Lister. It's a huge understatement to say that media are going through a myriad of problems, both internal and external, right now. Many of these constraints, says Jonathan Beerkus, online editor at the Namibian Broadcasting Corporation, who also has years of print experience behind his back. And these center on the newsroom itself.
The lack of leadership and management in newsrooms, the lack of investment by owners of media, and that's both private and public, and the looming mental health crisis in newsrooms.
And not least affected are journalists themselves, who grapple with various issues affecting their lives and livelihoods at the same time that they often bear the brunt of public criticism against a background of waning levels of trust in journalism in general.
Addressing the issue of quality journalism, especially about professionalism, the ethics about journalists, their conduct, then definitely the working conditions and the salaries, how they are remunerated.
Says Jemima Beerkus, senior reporter at the Sun newspaper, who is also part of current efforts to get a journalists' union off the ground. Please join me and my guest today as we examine some of these critical challenges. Jonathan, you recently wrote a piece that was published in New Era newspaper entitled "The Problems with the Media." And you took a lot of swipes across the spectrum at journalists, at newsroom management, all over the show. At the bottom of it, you are pointing out that some of the challenges that media are facing right now are of their own making.
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, as I said, and I wrote the piece because I wanted us to talk about our issues. We get insulted almost on a daily basis, and the press secretary of the presidency is notorious for hurling insults at the media. Anyway, I wanted us to talk about the issues that affect us. And I pointed out the lack of leadership and management in newsrooms, the lack of investment by owners of media, and that's both private and public, and the looming mental health crisis in newsrooms that remains untouched. No one is really talking about it. And I know a lot of colleagues taking depression medication, and basically across all newsrooms. We have serious alcohol and drug abuse problems in newsrooms, and we are just not talking about it. So I wanted us to start this conversation, and I was also a bit heartful of the way we've been treating our journalists, especially younger reporters. As I said in the piece, editors can easily walk away with up to 80,000 a month, while senior journalists get as little as 12 to 15,000 a month, and that is just too big a gap. And it speaks of this lack of investment in not just equipment but also human resources.
Exactly. I think some very pertinent points raised there, Jonathan, definitely, which media needs to talk about, and one of those is, of course, and you've touched on it, that it's lousy pay for a lot of journalists. That having been said, the fact that journalists haven't, over decades really, since independence, managed to get a union together, speaks also to journalists themselves, and maybe speaks to, almost opposite to what you say, to the fact that journalists here are maybe too comfortable or too complacent or not hungry enough like perhaps some of their colleagues on the African continent, where, as you know, pay is so bad that the problem of the brown envelope proliferates. So, Jemima, I know that you're part of a group that is now talking about getting a union off the ground.
Yeah,
give me some thoughts around why you're doing that now.
Well, I've personally been in the industry for only about 8 years myself, and I know even when I started, there were talks, people were really talking. I can't really say why people didn't manage to get it off the ground, but I think at this point, we have the energy in the industry right now. We have a lot of young journalists who realize how important this is. When it comes to are people not too hungry, I tend to have a problem with that because first of all, I think it's unfortunate that people think journalists must be hungry first before they can be given decent salaries. So maybe we are hungry enough now, if that must be it. But we are looking at we are talking about setting up a journalist union. We are about 70 journalists who talk to each other on a daily basis. We advise each other on issues. We talk to, I mean, some of these journalists have already been treated like Jonathan said, some of them sent home without any pay, some people, I mean, I know some journalists who are sleeping on their employers' backyards because they are not being paid, and this happens right on our doorsteps.
Right.
Then you find media owners saying, are you not hungry enough, or are you not, why is it that you cannot organize yourself? And I think, given the fact that Namibia is the mother of the Windhoek Declaration, we should not even have an issue about a union. We should be the first country that must pay its journalists decently. So yes, we are looking at a union because we realize how important it is. And perhaps COVID has given us this platform and a bit of a taste.
And the impetus
and
too.
Yes, that too. So yes, we are looking at that.
Yeah, because having said that, I mean, it's definitely worth mentioning that the media have been very severely affected, not necessarily because of COVID, but it's made the situation so much worse than it was prior to this pandemic. And as you say, journalists are facing pay cuts, a lot of retrenchments, and obviously a lot of media houses or smaller media institutions are simply shutting down.
And the issue, the biggest problem lies with the smaller media houses. They hire and fire at will. They do as they please. Some of these people, and because some of the media, we know how powerful a journalist by itself, a $12,000 journalist is. Imagine how powerful a $80,000 editor is. Do you think a journalist, a rookie journalist, would have the confidence to go seek for legal advice? This is not going to work. Because journalists are being trampled upon in the newsrooms, and Jonathan was talking about mental health issues. Most of these people do not even know what mental health is.
Exactly.
I mean, when I started out in journalism, I saw people handing out pills to each other, and I was like, what is this? Until I snapped myself, and I realized, oh, this is actually a big deal. And people are making jokes about journalists being drunk all the time. Some of these people are self-medicating because number one, they may not have a medical aid. Number two, they may even have it, but they don't even realize. First of all, they're so overworked, they don't even have the time. They don't. Some of these journalists, I know so many journalists walking the streets, they cannot get off because the people rely on them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you think, Jemima and Jonathan? Maybe you want to come in here. This is very concerning. This issue of mental health, particularly. What do you think has been the impetus, if you like, for that happening? Is this something new? Is this something that's been growing over time? Is it due to working conditions, pressure of the job? Where's this come from?
It's been in the newsroom since I came into the newsroom less than 20 years ago. But it used to be a drinking problem or drug problem. But journalists have been self-medicating for years. And it definitely is a work issue because we, as I said in the piece, we are not necessarily in a war zone. But the issues we get to deal with, when you know how many people come to you almost on a daily basis with the deepest and just issues, and journalists have to be therapists
for others all the time.
Assisting people.
Yes.
And we get exposed to the deepest and baddest poverty and crime. And you can't say this will not affect you. It will in the end. And on top of that is the financial issues. Things are just getting more expensive, and pay don't rise with the expenses.
Exactly.
And then there's the added workload in newsrooms nowadays. Journalists are knackered. They have to cover so many stories. They have to multitask. They don't just write a print story. They also have to take pictures and video. Sometimes even edit that. And like Jemima, them print journalists, but they appear on talk show, television talk show in the evening. And for the amount of work that journalists get to do, they just don't get the pay and the recognition for it. And I think this is where the mental problems come in.
And I think possibly, Jonathan, to add to that, we talk about people shooting the messenger, which is the media, and they get shot at all the time, let's face it. It is not a job that most of the time the public really look up to. The public are very quick to criticize, and most journalists who are doing the job aren't really thanked for it, let's face it. The other thing you mentioned, and it's very important, although we're not in a war zone, journalists still have to tackle a lot of issues that the public don't care or don't really know about. If we take just for example the hepatitis E outbreak, and a journalist going to do investigative reporting in those communities, those are things you take home with you.
Exactly.
You don't sleep at night because I always like to say that I think most journalists are doing what they do not because they want wealth and riches and glory, but because it's a public service. And so they're usually people of conscience, and they take those issues home with them and spend hours thinking about how can they help people.
I'm not sorry for chipping in. I'm not thinking of the COVID. When COVID broke out, I remember my colleague was inundated with calls. People, we would like to speak to him. Can you tell us what does this regulation mean? Please explain. So the whole day, this is how you spend half of your day. But going back to the mental health issues, we are human beings at the end of the day. I remember covering a hit and run one day, and my daughter was 5 years old at the time. The child looked just like my daughter, the child that was killed. And there I said, and I'm like, I'm supposed to write a story, and I'm just thinking this could have been my child. So you go home with this kind of trauma. Or I've been to the Kunene region. You go into the deep areas, and you go to the most impoverished communities.
Absolutely.
And you come from a culture where you at least give a $10 something, but this industry won't allow it. So you leave these people, they're going to die of hunger, but you're not allowed to do anything. These are the kind of things that really work on you. You go and you see all these things happening, but you must just write. You must just throw your notebook and go home and move on. That's what people expect.
But it affects you deeply. And I know I'm one of those people. I'm often myself critical of the media because I'm a journalist myself. I care very deeply about the state of our craft. And when I see lack of professionalism and lack of quality journalism, it really incenses me. At the same time, I'm journalism's greatest defender because I look at a public that critiques them all the time, and I often try and explain. Even in the past, in my days as an editor, I would get a minister calling me and saying, we're not prepared to speak to this journalist or that journalist or the other one, and I'll only speak. And I would say, you need to have understanding, and you need to help these young journalists make their way in life. Never forget, most people do a job where they're doing one thing. If you're a bank clerk, you're working with figures and money. Journalists are sent from, as you say, a story about a huge health crisis like hepatitis E to suddenly have to covering a water desalination plant to writing about Air Namibia's purchase of new aircraft.
So a hit and run.
They've got to be masters of everything they write about, and the pressures are immense. And the journalist who really cares about his or her craft is going to research all those things.
Yeah.
So they've got this sort of head full of information. And again, if there's a single little error, however unintentional, the public are so quick to pounce.
Yeah.
So as I say, there's this dichotomy, isn't there, about journalists, that so much is expected of us. And that sort of universal vision of a journalist is as this tough person who, as you say, Jonathan, back in the day of the good old hacks, as they call them, hard drinking, hard working, mostly men, who could take anything and all the pressures to get that story. Things have changed. It's not the same anymore. And people are affected very badly.
Just maybe the last thing before we step off, just editors, journalists, owners, normalize therapy.
Yeah.
Most medical aids pay for therapy, so see if your medical aid can pay for that, and go to therapy. There will be the odd person who talks negatively about therapy, but just go to therapy.
Exactly, and seek the help you need.
I think the other thing that must definitely be normalized is mentorship.
Yeah.
Because there is really no mentorship culture in the media industry. I personally had to back my way. I had to eventually quit a well-paying job to go and freelance and intern at no cost at all.
Yeah.
And I've when I started entering the political journalism sector,
yes,
people were looking at me, no, we can't talk to you. We'll speak to your colleague, which is obviously a male. And so I had to really push myself. And I've noticed even the female journalists, they are afraid. They feel they can't touch politics, they can't touch business because it's for the males. And the male journalists, they also shout it off as if it belongs to them. I've noticed in some, during gatherings, you would find the male journalists there in the corner because they are the important ones. They are talking there. So when a woman comes, they start talking about girlfriends and boyfriends or soccer because that's what women are good for. And I think it's really unacceptable that we are still where we are right now.
Exactly.
And it's that thing of the hierarchy in newsrooms having been flattened over the last 20 years.
Yes.
You used to have a news editor, sometimes associated editor, and an army of sub-editors.
Correct.
It's gone.
Yeah.
We don't have that. You are lucky if you get a news editor and a deputy news editor. So no one has time to mentor anyone.
Exactly.
And we've jumped on this bandwagon of bringing interns into the newsroom, but no one is training them. No one is mentoring them.
That's a very good point, Jonathan.
And we are going to lose, and we have lost, a lot of potentially very good journalists. So we need to look at that. We need to improve that. If we bring in young journalists, cub reporters, interns, we need to have a system of training them and checking what we've trained them.
Exactly.
And we can't just allow them to make coffee and do filing, as I've always said. We have to kind of let them loose in the world. But with guidance. Give them a good grounding before you release them.
Absolutely, a very good point that, because I think they're thrown in the deep end and they have to produce stories. And they shouldn't be. And all things being equal, I remember when I started as a journalist back in, yes, you better believe it, 1976, I had the option of taking a job on one of the major South African newspapers, where I would then have been required to do 2 years of internship first, where I would be writing births and deaths before I got anywhere near a news story. Today, these youngsters are put straight into doing major news stories, and if they haven't got the guidance they need, I think they flounder, and that may also give rise to some of the medical and psychological issues.
If they make a mistake, that hierarchy of checking and rechecking and applying your mind and your experience, that it doesn't exist. So a lot of mistakes unintentional slip through, and in the end that has to do it impacts on the quality of product we put out, and that in the end has an impact on the trust that the public,
absolutely,
because the public say, if you can't even get Gwen Lister's name right,
what can you? How can I trust the rest of what you do?
And the public don't see it as an intern. They don't know the details behind backstage. They just assume it's a journalist out there. And if you involve yourself in such a big story, then obviously you must be a senior journalist.
Exactly.
And that's how they treat him.
Exactly. On the other hand, Jemima, there is another side of the coin. And I know in the time since I've moved on from active daily journalism, I've mentored a lot of young people to varying degrees of success. Some have just risen to the challenge and they've eaten up everything. Others are not really interested. There is also, because, and it's largely, as you say, maybe newsroom management's fault, that these youngsters are put right on the front page right from day one, that they then feel, oh, maybe I don't need this guidance and mentoring. And I found that the basics, adherence to the basics is lacking. Just the fact that people need to be reading. Our journalists aren't reading anymore. So, as I say, we've got to look at both sides of the coin. There is, on the one hand, the fact that they're badly abused in some circumstances and left out to dry. On the other hand, are they really doing what they can to improve the levels of their journalism?
I agree with you, Gwen. I've experienced that some, especially the born-free journalists, they have, I don't know why it is, but they have this attitude that once they step into the newsroom, nobody's going to ask them anything, nobody's going to tell them anything, so they do what they want. You should not even assign them to something. They just take issue with every single thing, but it's not, like you've also said, it's not everybody.
No. There's some rising stars, let's be honest.
So I think we need to build on the ones that are willing to.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, the ones that do not want to be part of it will eventually leave.
And that is one of the big problems that we have. That pool of CAP reporters is shrinking because a few years ago I spoke to a second-year journalism class at NUST. There were 25 students there, and I asked them, when you graduate, what do you want to do? Only 2 of the 25 wanted to actually work in media.
PR?
These are media students, but they want to work in PR, they want to work for NGOs and the UN, and a few would maybe consider a TV presenter's job.
Exactly.
The glamour.
The softer
they want to look good. So that pool of young journalists is just getting smaller and smaller. And I think we have a responsibility as experienced people in media to continue to talk, continue to unearth, and it doesn't have to just be in journalists, in media students. I have seen people who studied law, for example, do very well in journalism.
Absolutely.
So if the passion is there, but you have to be on the ground, you have to talk to people, and if you continue to sit in your ivory tower in the office, it's not going to happen. No. Editors need to get out. Because they're so well paid, they all live in Eros. And no one drinks in the shebeens anymore. Pre-COVID.
Where they can pick up their stories.
Where they can pick up stories and identify good talent. So it's again down to us. We need to make the circle bigger, as the popular songs say. But we won't get that if we just sit in our offices. We have to go out there.
And you touch on a very important thing, which is character. Not everybody can be the journalist. Same as I often say, if I was put in a bank or made to be a bank manager, I'd run the bank into the ground in all likelihood. But so people are good at some things and not good at others. And it does, for journalism, it does take a very particular type of character, Jonathan. And at the end of the day, the sort of psychological pressures aside, you do need to be a person of kind of very strong character. You need to be able to take when it's dished out, whether it's the public, whether it's the type of stories that you cover that will break others' hearts. If you can't deal with it if you're not strong in yourself. And as you say, you have that passion, that commitment, that public service drive to push you through.
And you have to be able to stand by your story and take the criticism.
Exactly.
Because if it's a good story, there's always someone who will criticize it. And if you expose people, they will defend themselves.
Absolutely.
So it's definitely very important that we have confident journalists.
Sure.
Like, I know very, very, very few journalists are ready or prepared to even question the president because he is so condescending. He just cut people off when they ask him something. So a rookie reporter won't be even able to ask him about anything. So we need to work on the confidence of journalists that are sent to State House.
And also maybe there's a problem with, as Jonathan pointed out, even newsroom management, knowing the situation at State House, should not be sending their trainee journalists to cover a conference where they are going to be put upon by politicians, but rather send the tougher journalists, the more what can you say, experienced ones who can take it and dish it back out, if you like. But Jemima, let's quickly just get back to the union. Are you envisaging, or is it too early to say, the kind of union where you're going to deal mainly with labour issues such as remuneration, working conditions, overtime, or are you looking to a broader union which could also at the same time focus attention on that very important issue of quality journalism, ethical journalism, and also to do things like, we talk about things like salaries and they're bad. Something that may be very necessary is both a skills audit and perhaps a salary audit.
Absolutely.
Which is a doable project given the office of the Employment Equity Commissioner. Those sort of statistics, those figures are available for someone who's prepared to do the research and to find out what exactly are journalists earning at the various ranks. Are they very underpaid, or is it do they have benefits, things like that? So what are you thinking about union-wise in that regard?
Yes, like I've said earlier, we are still talking. We are looking at how we can handle this thing, but ideally we are looking at addressing the issue of quality journalism, especially about professionalism, the ethics about journalists, their conduct, then definitely the working conditions and the salaries, how they are remunerated, and mental health is certainly a very big deal.
Of course.
So we're looking, ideally it's going to be a bit broad, but it's a bit premature to say exactly how it would work.
It will work, but I'm so glad the discussion has started. And I really do hope it comes to something.
Yes, this is definitely a different time. We are definitely going to get it off the ground.
Yeah, excellent. Jonathan, perhaps we probably, as such an interesting discussion, we can just talk for hours about this. But let's get back to the good old public, the people who either make or break us in many ways, with the various media, vulnerable as it is. Especially, but not only because of this COVID pandemic. What has happened with the public? Why, especially when you look at traditional media, most notably newspapers, less so television and radio, but we've lost our audience to a very large degree to the online world, most particularly social media. How has that happened? Is it, to go back to your piece in New Era, is it our fault that we've lost that audience, or is it that they've just become very superficial in their appetite for news and information and want those clicks? They're not prepared to read a good investigative article anymore. How have we lost that, and how do we bring it back, if at all it's possible?
Yeah, it's there are myriad of reasons why, but people have easy access to the news. You get access to stories through Facebook, on a website, and media houses put out the stories as soon as it's in the paper or on on the bulletin.
Right.
So they put that out there for free.
Right.
You have to buy data from an internet service provider, and you give away your personal information for free to Facebook. But the media house doesn't get anything in return.
Yeah.
And when we started the multimedia department at the Namibian, we've seen how sharp the online audience grew. For the 2 years that I was responsible, it grew by 30% every year.
Right.
And it's the same trend I'm seeing now at the NBC. So people are definitely moving online. They don't want to pay for a physical copy of the Namibian anymore because they don't have to. So we need to find ways of getting a little bit back.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways how we can do that.
Right.
But we don't have enough time. So I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of how we can monetize and maybe get our own back. But people will always still buy the newspaper if the quality is good.
Right.
If the stories resonate with me. If I see people from my area, my hometown, my neighborhood, people who look like me in the paper, if we tell the stories of those people, if we continue to expose the rot in governance, if we continue to expose the unethical business environment in this country, we will continue
to get
the audience, whether it is on print, on radio, television. But the online audience will continue to grow as more and more people get access to the internet.
Right.
And more people have access to smart devices.
Right.
But we need to find a way of monetizing that audience.
Okay.
And I think it's important that for this to work, we also need to upscale our journalists.
Exactly.
You can't be, this is a time of swim or sink, so you have to reinvent yourself. As a journalist, media owners must really invest in training and, like he said, devices, because these are the tools people need.
And in a sense, it's all a vicious circle, isn't it? When you look at, if we look at lack of quality journalism, then we've also got to look at the places employing them. Do they have the wherewithal to invest in that training? And if they don't, why is it? Because the public aren't buying those mediums or supporting those mediums anymore. So I'm reminded of what Freya Weekblad's Max de Pree said recently, even in the view of the sustainability crisis for media, the demise of good journalism, that all we can do is do what we do best and do good journalism.
No.
And hopefully in that way we can bring back the public appetite for news, and that in turn will help us to pay journalists better, and they would be more professional in what they do. And
like someone recently said, at the end of the day, it will be journalism that will save itself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Jemima. That's a great note to end this podcast, and thank you both very much for joining us for what was a fascinating discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.